I go way back. We were in the same cohort at Duquesne, starting in our master's year. And I always got, Todd had a lot of little, more academic background than I did at that time. I was still a little wet behind the ears. So I really looked up to Todd as kind of like a big brother toward that time and still do. So it's great to have him be president of Division 32. I knew we would be in good hands. And I also want to just congratulate you on this wonderful conference. I know the enormous amount of work that goes into these. It's not your first go around, Todd. You've done 2 at Chicago School, and I've done a couple at Point Park, and have been behind some of these conferences in the past, as many of you know. And it definitely takes a chunk out of you when you do it. It takes a chunk or two.
Have a fantastic committee. So I appreciate that.
Good. Well, that always helps. Yeah, have a really good team. So I want to thank Brian Hanna and Roxy Christensen and Vanessa Brown and Andrew Bland and all the other volunteers who are involved, Gina Belton, and all of their wonderful work putting on this conference. It's really an honor to be here. I really am thrilled to be able to get the fellowship. I was a bit skeptical that I would get it, honestly. The 32. By the way, I'm getting over bronchitis, so I may have a hacking cough occasionally, and I'm not over it yet. This is like one of those things that lasts weeks and perhaps even a month or so. So I'm just got this really annoying cough. So bear with me on that. But anyway, it was a little bit of a slog, to get the fellows thing. But the Division 32 Fellows Committee was very encouraging. They thought that I more than met the criteria, and we went through the first time around. And I ended up getting rejected by APA the first go around. And there was some hints that there was a particular person on the committee who may have not been especially, how shall we say, kind toward me as a result of our efforts to sort of take down the DSM and to go after big pharma and that sort of stuff. So if that was the reason I got rejected, and it's we can only speculate, then good. I'm glad I got rejected. So we decided to wait 3 years until that guy was off the committee, and I reapplied, and then I got it. So that strategy worked. So anyway, it's great that I'm able to have that designation, because now I'm able to serve as on that committee and to write letters of recommendation and/or one or both of those for people who are looking to get fellows. And so keep that in mind as you continue to work toward developing your scholarship and doing your excellence in your practice, especially if it has a sort of an international scope. If you're having an impact internationally, that could qualify you for fellow. So yeah, it's great to be here today. So it's a bit of a somber topic. I mean, as Todd mentioned, we're finding ourselves, I think, quite literally in World War III at this point, which is not something I expected. I was waiting for the murder hornets, frankly. I didn't see World War III. I thought it was the murder hornets coming next after the COVID pandemic. I don't know what happened to the murder hornets. I don't know if anybody has any info on that, but they're probably coming right around the corner too, along with those spiders that float on their webs across the continents, apparently. So I'm going to talk about war as social pathology, and in order to be able to make the case that war is a form of social pathology, I'm going to need to talk, quite a bit about a little bit of the theory behind the concept of social pathology, and distinguish that from our conventional ways of understanding diagnosis and psychiatry. And I'm going to talk about that social pathology through what I call a hermeneutics of love. And so when we look at war as social pathology, then we can bring with that a kind of way of reading geopolitics as a form of hermeneutics of love, which sees war as social pathology and opens up certain possibilities that might not otherwise be apparent. That's the hope. Okay, so let me pull up my presentation and I'll break it down, the outline for you, so you know what we're doing. I want to go back to the beginning. All right, there we go. Okay, so there's the title, the full title, War as Social Pathology, Reading Geopolitics Through Hermeneutics of Love. So we'll start with a general outline. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through a variety of definitions of social pathology, and most of them are coming out of the field of critical theory, especially critical theory as it's been informed by the Frankfurt School. And as a result, as we begin to define social pathology or look at different definitions of social pathology, we'll see how social pathology is a different way of thinking about human suffering in contrast to individual psychiatric diagnosis. We'll look at some of the challenges and obstacles with diagnosis of social pathologies and how contributions from humanistic and existential theory can help us navigate some of those challenges and obstacles. And my own particular humanistic and existential approach to social pathology is informed by a hermeneutics of love. So I'm going to talk about that in contrast to a hermeneutics of suspicion. All of that will set us up for an analysis of geopolitical war as a social pathology. And then we'll have time for discussion. I will certainly leave time for discussion. This doesn't seem to have all the last objective didn't quite finish for some reason. So here are the course objectives for today. We're going to identify theoretical, empirical, and ethical arguments for the consideration of geopolitical war as a form of social pathology. We're going to compare and contrast a hermeneutics of suspicion and a hermeneutics of love as an interpretive frameworks for understanding and acting to remedy conditions of social pathology. And then we're going to discuss the contributions of humanistic and existential psychological theory for the diagnosis and treatment of social pathologies, including war and interpersonal violence. Okay, so when we look to the discourse on social pathology, we can find a variety of different examples of social disorder conceptualized sort of under what you might call the metaphor of disease, of a kind of disease model. You can go all the way back to Plato, who wasn't very fond of democracies, who referred to them as feverish, or Marx suggested that labor under capitalist conditions mortified the flesh and ruins the mind. Durkheim assessed how ill a community is based on the kind and number of suicides committed by its members. And and we can find a variety of other examples of medical metaphors that have been used to discuss social dysfunction. Some more recent examples that are identified by Friedenhagen include discussions of the 19th century Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. The sovereign debt crisis in Greece has been discussed as a social illness. The UK Prime Minister, following the 2011 riots, pronounced, quote, "Pockets of our society are frankly sick." The French economists assessed Brexit referendum as a pathological response to a very real sense of abandonment. In 2016, a German periodical diagnosed recent politics having disinhibited aggression and resentment as, quote, social pathological traits. Wilkinson and Pickett in 2009 argued that unequal societies are making its members more ill than equal ones. And then in 2006, the New York Times referenced a political scientist who described our contemporary democracies as ill, right? So the use of disease metaphors to talk about disordered, sort of social structures and processes is pretty common. And that's just sort of the tip of the iceberg, but some examples that you can find discussed in the literature. Now, when we actually go to define what social pathology is, we find that there's a lot of ambiguity around what it means, quite a variety of ways of defining it. Friedenhagen says that there's no consistent use as to whether it refers to the claim that society makes individuals ill, or the claim that society itself is ill, possibly irrespective of the illness of individuals, or to both claims at once. The notion of illness or pathology is often left vague, and medical categories of pathology are sometimes taken at face value, or at other times they're used more broadly to refer to individual flourishing or lack of flourishing. And one example of that is Axel Honith, who refers to social pathologies as determinants of self-realization. Some common criteria. I think we can point to two basic common criteria that sort of cuts across almost all of the, or maybe even all definitions of social pathology. One is there are dynamic social processes that if they're not stopped or reversed, they'll lead to increased deterioration of the situation, like an infection, of the body. And there's also some kind of ethical criteria that's used. So it has to do with the good or flourishing, or the bad or lack of flourishing, in contrast to more of a moral emphasis on justice and the right, or injustice and the wrong. So it's not justice and the right has its place within political philosophy, but what distinguishes social pathology is its emphasis on the good and flourishing, or the deficit of the good. So an emphasis on ethics as opposed to morality. Whoa. Okay, so one of the major thinkers on social pathology, and the one person who's probably the most cited these days from the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, sort of a third generation of the Frankfurt School, is Axel Honith. And according to Honith, social pathology operates in an ethical register, again, in contrast to the dominant liberal concern with moral categories like justice. And he identifies social pathology looking at three fundamental specifications. So one is when society falls short of the objectively already possible rationality. So there's a deficit in rationality. And capitalism is seen as modern society's pathogen as a result of capitalism's objectification and exploitation of people, instrumental rationality in the service of self-interest, and the structural deficits that follow from capitalism. And this is, not surprisingly, conjoined with an account of emancipatory interest. So deficits in rationality cause suffering, and recovery of suppressed rationality is necessary to address the root causes of the suffering. Another way of thinking about social pathology is in terms of the institutional differentiation of society. So here we can go back to Hegel's tripartite division of the social world into the family, civil society, and the state. So some critical theorists look at or conceptualize a healthy society as one in which different spheres each play their functional role. And so social pathology is a rationality deficit that either is a malfunction of one of those spheres, or one sphere sort of taking over or colonizing another. That's Habermas uses the term, colonizing. So for example, if the state sort of colonizes the family or civil society, that would be a form of social pathology. There are some critiques of the social differentiation concept. It tends to be a bit conservative, interestingly enough. It tends to implicitly accept that the social world is well constituted in principle, aims to either instate or reinstate how the social body functions if all its, quote, organs, the different spheres, are allowed to make their contributions uninhibited by other organs. And it inherently tends toward reformism. So it forecloses from the start the possibility that it's not the interaction of the organs of the social body that are problematic, but the social body itself is the problem. And there's a need for a replacement or radical transformation rather than repair. So to give you a sense of this, something that goes beyond this more kind of approach that's sort of grounded in a more conventional understanding of social norms, we can look to Theodora Dorno, one of the most important and influential figures of the first wave of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. So I'm going to quote him at length. He says, if such a thing as psychoanalysis of today's prototypical culture were possible, such an investigation would have to show that the sickness proper to the time consists precisely in normality. I think you get this might hurt your head a little bit, but the point here is that normality is itself the problem, right? The libidinal achievements demanded of an individual behaving as healthy in body and mind are such as can be performed only at the cost of the profoundest mutilation. No science has yet explored the inferno in which were forged the deformations that later emerged to daylight as cheerfulness, openness, sociability, successful adaptation to the inevitable, as equable, practical frame of mind, right? So in other words, the person who's sort of highly functioning within a disordered system are in some ways the most pathological from Adorno's perspective. The very people who burst with proofs of exuberant vitality could easily be taken for prepared corpses from which the news of their not quite successful decease has been withheld for reasons of population policy, and how the comfortlessness is the thought that the sickness of the normal does not necessarily imply as its opposite the health of the sick, but that the latter usually present in a different way the same disastrous pattern. It's actually, he's got a bit of a sense of humor there, for sure. Although it's a bit dry. So Adorno's claims here that what society considers normal and healthy comes at a high cost to individuals, and that's actually the norm is actually pathological and sick. And implicit in this claim is that society as a whole is dysfunctional because it demands a sick normality of its members. And so what is required is a radical critique of the social body. The disease is not conceptualized as a malign relation between otherwise healthy organs, but as pertaining to the social body as a whole. Adorno is drawing from Marx as well as from Freud, and so he utilizes the concept of repression. So for Adorno, excuse me. So for Adorno, what's operative in the case of the sort of pathology of normalcy is a double layer of repression. Adorno writes, quote, "The regular guy, the popular girl have to repress not only their desires and insights, but even the symptoms that in bourgeois times resulted from repression." Right? So they're not only are they having to suppress their desires and thoughts, but they have to repress their symptoms that reveal the underlying pathology behind their normality. That's kind of the implication. To detect the pathology, one needs to take a perspective on society as a whole, not by looking at individuals as atomistic entities. Adorno writes, quote, "For socially ordained sacrifice is indeed so universal as to be manifest only in society as a whole, not in the individual. Society, as it were, assumed the sickness of all individuals." That creates kind of a tall order, right? Because how do you it's a bit of a problem for us psychologists if Adorno's on the right track, right? Because if normality presents as a kind of adjusted, well-adjusted sort of cheerfulness that's disguising underlying, distress and alienation that itself becomes repressed, then it's not easy to access, right? It's something that becomes kind of invisible, but only can be seen within a larger social and historical context. So you have to move from an assessment of the individual to the micro processes that sort of produce the character of the individuals within the social system. And if you're only looking at the psychological level without the social level, then you miss that. Another way that social pathology is conceptualized is according to a concept of organized self-realization. Here, Axel Honith makes a contribution as well. So he identifies a form of social pathology that is linked to the genuinely worthy ideal of self-realization. So he thinks self-realization is a worthy ideal, but it becomes co-opted into the reproduction of capitalist society in such a way that paradoxically its realization is at the same time its betrayal, right? So there's a kind of a false consciousness in sort of Marxist terms, right, where the person forms a particular kind of self-understanding, which is understood as a form of self-realization, but it's really a kind of it's a product of alienation, where the person doesn't recognize the origins of that character within a particular social system that creates the character in the person as a way of sustaining a dysfunctional system. People have to feign self-realization activities to become employed, for example, or to stay employed, or to get promoted. And as a result, people end up experiencing feelings of inner emptiness and meaninglessness, which causes rising levels of depression, for example. Or there's outward performances of practices and actions by which the individual is alienated. And even battle cries for emancipation and criteria for social critique can become instruments of domination within dysfunctional social systems, right? So they can get co-opted and used in the service of, say, hierarchies of domination rather than the service of liberation. Closely related to these concepts is, and really adopted by Axel Honith, is a concept that comes from Christopher Zurn. And he looks at social pathologies as operating, quote, by means of constitutive disconnects between first order contents and second order reflexive comprehension of those contents, where those disconnects are pervasive and socially caused. So this is a little bit abstract. I found it difficult to start wrap my head around this a bit, but the way I would sort of understand it from a more psychological perspective is that there are sort of you might say, the distal causes of my self-understanding, of who I understand myself to be as a subject, for example, are produced by certain first order contents, right? A certain social, cultural, linguistic, set of systems and practices and ends. And then there's the way that I come to understand who I am and how I came to be who I am, which is disconnected from its social cultural origins, right? It doesn't recognize its social embeddedness, right? So in that sense, a form of that for Zurn is itself a form of social pathology, right? Where one fails to recognize the social cultural origins of one's very subjectivity and understanding of what it means to be a subject. I think this is, in some ways, has a lot of affinities with sort of some of the work that's been done with the French post-structuralists like Michel Foucault, for example. Although there's differences, but I don't have time to get into all that. There's also a way of thinking about what Zurn is getting at if we think about the concept of ideology. So it's really, what he's really producing here is a concept of ideology, that those subject to false consciousness are not, quote, cognizant of how those beliefs come about. And this disconnect is pervasive and socially caused, involving, quote, hiding or repressing the needed reflexivity of the social participants about the structures of belief formation and the connection of those culturally cognitive structures to the material ordering of the social world, unquote. And Honith takes this and he links this self-realization becoming ideology and as a product of productive forces in a deregulated economic system. And then he attributes this to the rapid rise in depression. So to give you an illustration of how that leads to psychopathology. So the origin of psychopathology is rooted in this kind of second order disorder. Okay, another example is Neil Harris. So Neil Harris outlines different dimensions of a social pathology diagnosis, and I'll just review these briefly. So he says, one way of thinking about social pathologies is they can be conceptualized as obstacles present in forms of life that structurally inhibit human flourishing. So in other words, if there's certain styles of living that are being sort of promoted, sustained, rewarded, taught within a particular social order, and those forms of life somehow impede human flourishing, then that would constitute a form of social pathology. That is going to inevitably be tied to certain kinds of self-perpetuating social dynamics that are negative in the sense that they inhibit human flourishing. So the point here is that the forms of life are not just something that are adopted by individuals, but that are embedded within, macro level social processes, often, operating behind the backs of people, within the culture or the society. And then another way that's sort of congruent with this is to think of society as having failed to attain the highest standards of historically effective reason. Usually this is understood in a more sort of dialectical sense of reason in the sense of Hegel and Marx. But essentially, it's not an idealist concept. It's more of a dialectical materialism, right? So history failing to, essentially emancipate and liberate its members would be the fullest extent of reason. And then what follows from that is the social inculcation of pathologies of normalcy. In other words, there are certain forms of pathology, like we saw with Adorno, that come to be accepted as typical and the norm and even socially rewarded, but and even the people themselves who are suffering from those pathologies of normalcy may not recognize their own suffering, right? They may, because they interject or adopt the discourse of the dominant culture and reference their experience in sort of positive frames when actually it's causing suffering and dysfunction. And also Harris emphasizes something we haven't talked about much yet, which are social pathologies of recognition. So this idea that pathologies occur when there's failures of recognition within society. Certain groups, for example, are failed to be recognized as fully human, for example, or as having dignity. Okay, so that is a very quick survey of some of the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time talking about Erich Fromm, because I think Erich Fromm, in my opinion, offers one of the best frameworks for thinking about social pathology, particularly with his concept of the pathology of normalcy. So when he talks about this idea of a pathology of normalcy, he is in social pathology, he's drawing from an analysis of the social world as incommensurable with the demands of what he calls a normative humanism. Well, what does that mean? By normative humanism, and this is somewhat controversial concept, and something we can discuss when we get to our discussion. But his position is that there is such a thing as a kind of universal human needs. And in that sense, he's somewhat in alignment with some of the major framers of humanistic theory, like Abraham Maslow and his hierarchy of needs, or think about Carl Rogers when he talks about the necessary and sufficient conditions, which for healing relationships. Anytime there's a position that suggests that there may be something that is innate to the human condition that can be frustrated or disturbed or interfered with, and that can lead to ill health or dysfunction, you're referencing something like a normative humanism. Now, there is sort of you might say a postmodern or post-structural critiques of normative humanism, where human nature is not seen as something that's static, but seen as something that's more dynamic. And in that case, I think there have been efforts by some theorists to try to fuse a kind of Frommian concept of pathology of normalcy with a more postmodern sensibility. And I'll just leave it at that for now, because that's a whole other can of worms. But I'll just say that if you think that there's such a thing as certain basic human needs that can be frustrated and cause pathology, then you're sort of adopting a position of normative humanism. And that's Fromm's position. So to the extent that people within society, subjects within the society, fail to realize their potential, their potential to self-actualize, using more American humanistic terminology, then that would result in what Fromm calls socially patterned defects, right? So it's something that is so pervasive in the society as a sort of failure of flourishing that it's not even recognized as a form of pathology. So I'll give a few examples, but I'll give you a list of a bunch of examples from different theories in a minute. But just to give you an example, like something like consumerism, right? Like just racking up your, going to the mall and just like ratcheting up that credit card, like putting yourself in debt. That might be something that might be seen as very normative, right? It's something that people do, and you might not be stigmatized or seen as having a disorder that's in need of treatment. I don't think there's a pathological consumption disorder yet in the DSM, consumerism disorder or something like that. So it's something that people do and don't necessarily recognize as a problem, and yet it can cause all kinds of suffering, as we know from empirical research. So in that sense, it's a socially patterned defect. Where that pathological state is reinforced as the norm, then that gets reinforced through a process of what Erich Fromm calls a consensual validation. So in other words, there's some, you might say a semi-consensual. It doesn't necessarily have to be everybody's on board, but there's a large portion of the culture, or at least the cultural elite, that has power over the channels of communication, create the perception, at the very least, that there's some consensual validation, that certain kinds of behaviors or certain ways of operating in the world are perfectly fine, even though they're damaging to yourself or to others. Okay, so Fromm raises the question, what is sanity? And here's a quote this is from his book, The Sane Society. He says, "Nothing is more common than the idea that we, the people living in the Western world of the 20th century, we could say now the 21st century, are eminently sane. Can we be so sure that we're not deceiving ourselves," right? It's an important question, isn't it? So he's raising that question to get to this concept of a pathology of normalcy, that he says many psychiatrists and psychologists simply refuse to even entertain the idea that society as a whole may be lacking in sanity. They hold that the problem of mental health in a society is only that the number of unadjusted individuals, and not that of a possible unadjustment of the culture itself. Right. So this is a real obstacle, because traditional social science and social theory has tended to conceptualize normality, or at least one way of conceptualizing normality is sort of statistical normality, right? Is to say that what's normative is what's the most common within a culture, right? So if you think of the statistical norm as your concept of normality, then that's going to be an obstacle to understanding this concept of the pathology of normalcy. Because what people tend to think of is, when they think of normal, they think good, they think healthy, they think, adjusted, right? Well adjusted. So those two tend to get conflated. So we think of what's typical as being what's well adjusted. And so what Fromm is suggesting is that we shouldn't make the assumption that just because something is typical, a behavior or a style of thinking or a personality trait, just because it's accepted and ubiquitous and typical within a culture, doesn't mean that it's healthy, good, conducive to human flourishing, right? So something that's statistically normal can be pathological. It doesn't have to be a statistical outlier in order to be pathological. It can be what he calls a socially patterned defect. So this is where normative humanism comes in, right? It's in contrast to the sociological relativism, which postulates that each society is normal in as much as it functions in the way that it does, and that pathology can only be defined to the extent that an individual fails to adjust to the ways of that society. In contrast, in normative humanism, then there are universal criteria for mental health, which are valid for the human race, and according to which the state of health of each society can be judged. That's, again, a controversial position, but it's Fromm's position. Tenets of humanism. So Fromm isn't really placing an emphasis on a kind of biological reductionism nor a kind of sociological reductionism. I would also say that he's not suggesting that people are purely socially or biologically determined. That, in fact, the whole point is that if we can, to some extent, begin to become aware of our false consciousness, right? If we can be aware of how we're being shaped by our social and cultural realities and how it may be detrimental to our well-being, then that is a form of liberation, to the extent that it allows us to cut. We are freed from alienation to the extent that we come to recognize our capacity as agents to work towards social change, to free ourselves from those disordered social conditions by working in solidarity with our neighbors. So it's not a separation of the biological and the social. It looks more at the total existence of the people. And it is based on the belief that there's right and wrong, or satisfactory and unsatisfactory solutions to the problem of human existence. So then how does Fromm come to identify what mental health means? Here's what he says. He says, mental health is achieved if man develops into full maturity according to the characteristics and laws of human nature. Mental illness consists in the failure of such development. From this premise, the criteria of mental health is not one of individual adjustment to a given social order, but a universal one, valid for all men, of giving a satisfactory answer to the problem of human existence. Again, he draws upon this concept of consensual validation. Here he means the state of mind of members of a society, and the fact that there tends to be a sort of overall consensus that we could identify within a particular culture that gives it, that gives the culture its identity, its particular style of being. And the fact that the majority of people, he says, share certain ideas and feelings does not provide the validity of these ideas and feelings, and that consensual validation should not be a reason for justifying conceptions of mental health. Okay, defects. So he talks about socially patterned defects, and before he gets to that, he defines what a defect is. He said, if a person fails to attain freedom, spontaneity, a genuine expression of themselves, he may be considered to have a severe defect, provided we assume that freedom and spontaneity are the objective goals to be attained by every human being. So you can see how he starts with a sort of normative claim. There's a good way of operating in the world. And then if there's some deficit, then we call that a defect. And so a socially patterned defect is when some failure or deficit in well-being or flourishing is common and typical and even socially rewarded within the culture. So, for example, turning to his identification of freedom and spontaneity as examples of human health, he says when freedom and spontaneity are not attained by the majority of the members of a given society, that would be a socially patterned defect. And he says when that occurs, the individuals within that society are not aware of it as a defect, and security is not threatened by the experience of being different or an outcast because they all share the same defect. So the very defect, in fact, he says, may be raised to a virtue by the culture, and this gives the individual an enhanced feeling of achievement. All right, so what would a sane society look like? Here's his quote. He says, a sane society is that which corresponds to the needs of man, not necessarily to what he feels to be his needs, because even the most pathological aims can be felt subjectively as that which the person wants most, but to what his needs are objectively, as they can be ascertained by the study of man. And it's our first task then to ascertain what is the nature of man and what are the needs which stem from this nature, unquote. he also makes a distinction between defects and neurosis. That a defect, he says, if a person fails to attain freedom, spontaneity, well, I'll tell you what, I already went over that. I'm going to skip that part. Let me get to man's needs. So again, how does Fromm puts himself in a position where he's claiming a normative humanism as a kind of ideal against which the socially patterned defect is evaluated. So that now he's in a position where he has to come up with a normative, vision of humanity. In other words, what is the good life, right? What does it mean to flourish? And so he does that. In the Sane Society, he comes up with a need theory, and in order to be able to say that certain kinds of societies or certain kinds of cultures that fail to meet these basic human needs are producing socially patterned defects, and therefore they're creating social pathologies. So very briefly, he makes a distinction between relatedness versus narcissism. So he would say in a healthy society, it would foster relatedness rather than narcissism, right? Rather than being self-centered, people would be more self-transcending, to use the language of Viktor Frankl and Abraham Maslow. And that the forms of transcendence would realize themselves in creativeness rather than destructiveness, right? So that when we're trying to work through conflicts or problems with one another, one of the ways that we can deal with that is through violence, war, various forms of agonistic denial of the other person's humanity, dehumanizing sort of practices that assault the dignity of the other. There's all kinds of destructiveness that we can do in order to try to manage our conflicts, right? Usually in the form of some kind of domination or oppression. And Fromm suggests that, a healthy transcendence would involve finding creative solutions to avoid that kind of destructiveness, right? So a healthy society that fosters creativeness rather than destructiveness would be what you'd want to create, what you'd want to foster. He also talks about rootedness, brotherliness rather than incest. What he means by this is that, there is a tendency to want to sort of favor our kin, to be sort of, and it takes some development. It's a bit of a developmental achievement in order to move towards a more universal humanism where we recognize all people as having dignity, and we're not just partial to the people that we're related to or our friends, right? So a healthy society would move towards not just recognizing, people in our culture or people in our family or people who are, people that are in my circle of identity as being human, and people outside of my circle as being less than human. And then sense of identity, he thinks that a great danger is herd conformity, that when people lose their capacity to think for themselves, to think critically, to be able to voice their concerns and criticisms, and to fall in line either through fear or an attempt to belong, or through some kind of desire for security, become aligned with the majority, then that leads to all kinds of irrationality. And we know from social psychology that there's all kinds of research illustrating how that happens. I mean, think of some of the classic experiments, in social psychology in the 60s and 70s, So for Fromm, individuality, by the way, he doesn't think of individuality as individualism. He means that a successful society or a flourishing society would allow for the recognition of each person as having a kind of distinctive dignity, right? That's not reducible to, say, social categories or social identities. That yes, those are important, but we're more than that, right? There's something intrinsic to each person and I think that's a very common value that we see shared within the humanistic tradition of psychology. And then reason over irrationality, which perhaps is somewhat self-explanatory, but I'll kind of leave it at that. All right, so that's Maslow's theory, how he uses needs as a way of sort of situating social pathology. Okay, so Thompson is another theorist. Whoop, I think I skipped it. Yeah, Michael J. Thompson also studies sociopathology, and he looks at social pathology as a result of hierarchies. And according to him, social pathology results from hierarchical forms of social structure that are based on domination, control, and subordination. And then that becomes internalized as norms that shape and hold together hierarchical social formations that cause pathologies within the self. And then these hierarchical groups operate to protect economic surplus and are consistent with structures of relationships that shape self-consciousness and self-constitution of its members, and then constitutive rules and norms pattern the relationship, and he says possess, quote, deontic power to generate a duty on behalf of agents. And then finally, recognition, because it's embedded within these social hierarchies, tends to legitimate rather than undermine the irrational social order. So this is a bit of a critique of Axel Honith. Axel Honith is trying to ground social pathology in this sort of idea of recognition. And Thompson is saying the problem with an emphasis on recognition is it's too much in the head. It's not enough of a focus on the macro social systems that are producing concepts of self-realization, which within systems of domination get expressed in forms of alienation and false consciousness. Let's see. So Thompson outlines what it would take for a successful critical theory of society. He says, first, we need to diagnose the objective structures, processes, and ends that give shape to our social reality, thereby granting us a critical theory of judgment that calls into question such defective social forms, and at the same time, while providing the groundwork for alternative ideas and conceptualizations of social value that can lead to social transformation. A pretty good summary of these perspectives is put together by Ono Hirvonen, who develops an ontology of social pathologies, and he distinguishes between a thin sense of social pathology and a thick sense of social pathology. One that we haven't really talked about because I really think it doesn't adequately understand social pathology is this thin sense, where pathology is seen as just a deviation from social norms, basically a failure to follow a normative order of society, or pathology is a deviation from social norms but has a common shared structure, like Zern's second order disorders. I'm much more favorable to the thick sense of social pathology, where pathology is located within the social structures, the macro structures. The illness is in society, not in the persons. They express symptoms that appear as psychopathology, but they're not. The pathology isn't located in the person. People may in fact be functioning perfectly well, but they're functioning within the social context is perpetuating a pathological social system. And then another way of understanding this is that pathology is a disturbance in the process of social life. So here you have a more of a sense of social life as something that's in the process of developing and evolving. And so something that's pathological from a social perspective is something that would sort of ossify, reify, close down, change and transformation within the social structures. A sort of resistance to change would be the pathology. Okay, so that's a very quick, broad survey of all the different ideas that I've been able to find on social pathology that's in the literature. I think I've captured a good bit of it. I think Lehtinen and Sarkela raise some interesting questions, and they have their own speculations about how we might go about addressing these questions. But what I thought is I would list these 8 questions, and I would tell you a little bit about sort of how I think about them. So the first question is, what is the affected entity? Is it the individual or is it the society? So one way we can think about social pathology is we can say that social pathology is when somebody has individual psychopathology, but it's caused by some social factor, right? So we can think of war, right, as a form of social pathology because it causes post-traumatic stress disorder and other forms of mental illness, right? So that's one way of thinking about it. Another way of thinking about it is to see that the social system itself would have the diagnosis. If a social system is dysfunctional, whether or not it produces psychopathology, you could diagnose it as being disordered. Now, I think that's kind of a false dichotomy. That I think really the solution is both. That how do you evaluate whether a social system is disordered? Well, you have to see whether it produces disordered people. And I think that the idea that I have a problem with taking the false consciousness theory to such an extent that people are really well functioning and perfectly healthy and saying that somehow they're expressing, a disordered characterological formation because they're perpetuating a sort of bad society. I think there's something to that. But I think that if my assumption, and this is something I would have to defend, is that when people are living in such a way that they're enabling or propping up a social system that itself is harmful, I'll say I have a certain, you might call it naive, but I think it's a realistic faith that people on some level recognize the emptiness of their aims and that they will suffer as a result of a disordered system of values that allows them to perpetuate a system that's dysfunctional. But that requires a certain faith in humanity to take that position. So I guess it depends on how pessimistic or optimistic you are about people. Another interesting issue is what are the range of cases? Like how, what kinds of things would we even begin to study? Well, obviously, from the title of my presentation that war is going to be something I'm going to make the argument is a case of social pathology, but there's lots of other examples, which I'll give you in a minute. Another interesting question is if something, which is the chicken and which is the egg kind of problem? Is social pathology a result of certain social wrongs? And so that's how we define social pathology, as sort of consequences that follow from certain social wrongs. Or is social pathology, is something a social pathology because it's a social wrong, or something a social wrong because it's a social pathology, right? That's the chicken and egg kind of problem. And I don't think there's, my position on that is social wrongs are not necessarily social pathologies. This goes back to the individual and society question. That something is a social pathology when it causes deficits in human flourishing or mental illness. They raise some other interesting questions that I'm not going to get into. Is the naturalist vocabulary to be taken seriously? Is society really an organ that can become sick, or is it more of a metaphor or analogy? My tendency is to think of it more as not too literally, but as more of a metaphor, a productive metaphor. That social pathologies, I'll argue, share a kind of structure that I'll talk about in a minute. And they offer some other useful questions that that you can read more if you look into their research. But just to give you an illustration of all the different ranges of cases, here are just a few people who study social pathology in the full range of pathologies that they identify as targets, of their theories. So Axel Honith looks at pathologies of ideological recognition, maldistribution, invisibilization, rationality distortions, and so on. Or you could look at Charles Taylor, who looks at loss of meaning, or eclipse of ends in the face of rampant instrumental reason, and so on. So there's lots of different problems, social problems that are targeted as forms of social pathology. Nobody, except in passing, mentions war as a form of social pathology, although Fromm does, but he only sort of mentions it in passing. It doesn't really focus on it. to a great extent. Okay, so now I'm at a point where I'll give you a formulation of a way to distinguish social pathology from psychiatric disorder. Then in the case of psychiatric disorders, we're describing a syndrome that's embodied by a set of symptoms that cause suffering and or behavioral dysfunction within the person's life. It may have biological, psychological, and or social factors that contribute to it, though psychiatry tends increasingly to emphasize biological factors as the most proximal cause of mental illness. But even when we're assigning causal or ideological value to social factors, the tendency is to locate the problem or the dysfunction in the intervention within the person rather than within the disordered social system that causes the pathology. Social pathology, in contrast, is a result of macro social processes that produce, sustain, or resist intervention into characterological patterns of human behavior. And again, the characterological behavior may be statistically normal or typical, but it's assessed as contributing to diminished well-being and defined either as psychopathology or a lack of flourishing. In other words, a reduced quality of life. And then social pathology involves an intrinsic link between disordered macro-social processes that produce disordered persons. So this is what Fromm is referring to when he talks about socially patterned defects and pathology of normalcy. And then further, the disordered social character functions to sustain and perpetuate the disordered status quo to the detriment of the persons living within those systems, and typically through acceptance of the status quo as a form of false consciousness. So that's my working definition. Okay, so I'm getting to war coming soon here, but I want to mention a few other thinkers from the existential and humanistic traditions that I think offer unique contributions beyond the Frankfurt School theorists that we've talked about so far. Someone who I've found very influential in my own thinking is the work of René Girard, a French theorist who's very interdisciplinary, and his concept of memetic desire. So people have needs, and we find that, of course, in Maslow and Fromm and self-determination theory. But what I think is interesting about Girard is he says once we sort of meet our basic needs, we don't necessarily go on to self-actualize the way Maslow talks about. That we tend to, we have what he calls desire. In other words, there's this sort of excess. There's an excess energy, you might say, that goes out in search of what to do with those, that surplus of resources beyond need. And so think about, I'm hungry and I could eat something that's a very inexpensive, form of nutrition that's good for me, might not taste great, but it satisfies my need for hunger. Or I could go to a gourmet restaurant, right, and have a really extravagant, meal and pay a lot of money for it, right? One is satisfying a need, the other satisfying a desire that goes beyond the fundamental need. So Girard says once we start thinking about issues beyond need, then we get into memetic desire, that we tend to adopt desires by modeling others. We learn to desire what's desirable through, observing what others do and what they desire. And it's not hard to find examples of this. A 2-year-old, playing in the family room at the family party, and one of them picks up a toy, and then suddenly, all the other kids want that same toy, and it escalates often into, some form of aggression. Would be a typical kind of Girardian scenario. So this is when memetic desire, bubbles up into memetic rivalry and becomes, violent, erupts into violence and aggression. Now, not all memetic desire necessarily erupts into aggression. For Girard, there are types of memetic desire that choose models that are not sort of peers, not contemporaries and peers with whom we could get into conflict. So think about, like earlier, Donna Rockwell talked about mindfulness. Well, some Buddhists who are practicing mindfulness, turn to Buddha, as a model, right? Or maybe they turn to some teacher, who's a model, but that teacher is not someone who they see as a sort of rival, right? They're seen as someone to inspire them and emulate. or think about the way Jung talks about Christ as a kind of image of the whole self, that we move towards in sort of individuation, right? It's a kind of the logos that we use to sort of integrate and structure the self. That kind of idea that there's some divine image, or maybe a saint, or a highly esteemed historical figure, somebody who we look to as a model. For Girard, those kinds of models tend to be healthy. They tend to give us direction and help us, in Jungian terms, to individuate. When we sort of become rivals with our neighbor, so to speak, like keeping up with the Joneses, that's when things get, a little hairy. The other person comes to be seen as an obstacle, even though the other person is the source of our desire. They come to be seen as an object of desire, especially when there's perceptions of scarcity. And then eventually the other person becomes understood as the obstacle itself to desire, which misrecognizes the other, fails to recognize them as the source of desire. And so as a result of this, there is a escalation into aggression, a kind of Hobbesian war of all against all, which threatens social stability. So according to Girard, the way this tends to get resolved, the reason why we haven't killed each other off as a species, is because we use scapegoat mechanisms. So powerful rivals align with each other against innocent, usually powerless scapegoats as a way of displacing their aggression that would otherwise threaten the social order. And for our purposes, what's interesting is Girard even talks about psychiatric diagnoses as scapegoat mechanisms. He writes a paper on eating disorders, right? He says eating disorders are not really a form of deviation from the norm. He says the problem with eating disorders is they follow the norm too well, right? They follow the thin ideal so well that it threatens their very lives and their well-being. And he says that's the nature of psychiatric problems, is they in a certain sense, similar to the way Fromm talks about characterological disorders as being sort of socially patterned defects. Girard is saying the same thing, except what gets somebody diagnosed is when they take the norm to such an extreme that it shows up the problem with the whole system. It reveals or sort of unveils the dysfunction within the system. And so that person has to be dealt with through some kind of symbolic process of exile, right, or emulation. And in the case of psychiatry, you do that by stigmatizing them with a disorder, a disease, putting them in treatment. So for Girard is usually pretty pessimistic, especially in his later life. He really just thought that we're basically screwed and it's all we're headed toward nuclear catastrophe. And so he wasn't a real cheerful guy, but there are indications along the way where he maybe offers suggestions for what might be a way out. One is he suggests, especially earlier in his career, that there may be sort of agopic models. There may be certain models of desire that show us how to be self-transcending, how to be loving towards one another, how to adopt models of nonviolence. So think about a Buddha or a Jesus or a Mother Teresa or a Thich Nhat Hanh or a Gandhi, right? Or pick your poison, or a Rumi, right? Or Bell Hooks, right? Somebody who chooses a kind of agopic stance and in a position of nonviolence could be a way out, but he's not real optimistic that that's going to happen. But he's saying maybe if we did that, we might survive. And the other thing I think he suggests is that we align with scapegoats. When somebody's being scapegoated or a group is being scapegoated, that what we should do is align ourselves with the scapegoat against. But he said that takes an enormous amount of courage, because often that means that we become scapegoats as well. And so there's almost a sense in which Girard is advocating a willingness to be martyred. Think about the poster on eco martyrs that we have this during this conference would be an illustration of that. Okay, another person I think gives us some tools for thinking about social pathology is Jan Hendrik Vandenberg in his Metabolic Phenomenology. He does a historical analysis of changing worldviews that shape human existence. And he thinks about neurosis as sociosis. These are expressions of psychopathology that only makes sense when understood within the dynamism of social forces, as they're erupting and changing and shifting over history. And in modernity, he sees the divided self of the neurotic as an expression of an increasingly complex society, where we have a greater gap between, say, children and adults or social classes, and et cetera. That the theme is one of the vision and a larger gap between people that results in having to live in multiple worlds at once, and therefore having, divided, conflicted selves. Robert Romanician, following Vandenberg, suggests adopting metabletics as a cultural therapy, as kind of a psychoanalysis of culture, in the same way that you would look to a person's history and recover, repressed memories in order to unleash new possibilities of being. You could do this same thing, but on a collective level through a metabletic phenomenology. And then I think Ernest Becker and terror management theory have some tools that they can offer us, that we can think of both individual and cultural pathologies as linked to dysfunctional management of death anxieties and flight from recognition of personal and collective mortality. That people we know from TMT, from terror management theory, tend to buffer death anxiety through buffering their self-esteem and identifying with certain symbolic systems as a form of immortality striving. And when people become aware of death, this threatens their self-esteem by undermining their faith in symbolic systems. And this can lead to compensatory hostility to outgroups and favoritism to in-groups, which fosters conditions for conflict, violence, and war. And then conflict, violence, and war, in turn, amplify death anxiety. So it leads to a sort of vicious circle of interpersonal destruction, fostering and perpetuating, the ubiquity of war, conflict, and violence. Another person I want to point to is Martin Luther King and his vision of the beloved community as a kind of vision of what a good society would look like, rooted in mutuality and agapic love and recognition of human dignity as a kind of personalistic ethical foundation for the good society. And in that sense, he calls for something that should remind us of Erich Fromm and his concept of the pathology of normalcy. He calls for creative maladjustment. He says to be maladjusted in the context of a disordered society is actually to be healthy, to the extent that it refuses to adjust itself to the social pathology. So the people who are suffering, who are angry, who are depressed, who are anxious, they're the healthy ones, in the sense that they're refusing to adjust themselves to systems of domination and oppression, for example. And King has his own diagnoses of social pathologies. He sees three as being his primary targets, and those are poverty, racism, and militarism, which of course would include war. Okay, so now I think we're in a position to begin to look at a model for diagnosing war as a form of social pathology. I've given you a lot of tools, and I've brought a lot of tools to the table, and I'm going to use all of them to try to articulate how we can conceptualize war as a form of social pathology. But I have a few more steps to go. And that is, as I mentioned, Fromm appeals to a need theory, his own need theory. We have Abraham Maslow, who's in our tradition, he has a need theory. We have Carl Rogers. Something I haven't mentioned is self-determination theory. And I think in many ways, there's some good evidence in some, I think, pretty strong empirical basis for making the argument that social determination theory, it can be integrated with Rogers, Maslow, and Fromm. That if you look at the theories of Maslow, Fromm, and Rogers, they're very congruent, and they can be integrated with self-determination theory. But basically, the idea of self-determination theory is that we have certain intrinsic needs, and those needs are autonomy, competency, and relatedness. And that when we're sort of following our natural inclination, our organismic valuing process, as Rogers would call it, or felt sense, as Gendon would call it, when we're in touch with our embodied wisdom, maybe is another way to say it, we tend to be oriented in the direction of developing these intrinsic needs. When we lose touch, when we become incongruent with our felt sense, with our organismic valuing processes, in Rogers' sense of that term, then we tend to begin to move towards a kind of alienation or even a kind of false consciousness where we're oriented towards extrinsic motivations like status, consumerism, and interpersonal competition for resources. And there's lots of research out there in the social psychology literature supporting this theory. And I think it actually provides a very useful framework for thinking about social pathology. So social systems that meet intrinsic needs are, relatively healthier than those that foster extrinsic motivations and needs. So we can think of social pathology as social macrostructures that frustrate or fail to meet fundamental needs. Okay, based on that, I'm putting forward a theory of motivation that's somewhat inspired by Viktor Frankl, but goes beyond Viktor Frankl. And some of you who've read Man's Search for Meaning or other works by Frankl probably know how he distinguishes between the will to pleasure, the will to power, and the will to meaning. So I've taken Frankl's model, and I think the problem with meaning, the will to meaning, is it's too vague, it's too broad. Like in a certain sense, isn't pleasure meaning too? Power is a kind of meaning too. So I think it's better to distinguish between, to talk about two other types of motivations that I think are implied in the way Frankl talks about the will to meaning. One is a project, doing something you think is going to give back to humanity in some way, right? And having one's suffering be finding some grace, so to speak, in your suffering. I think we can sort of attach that to a will to justice and a will to love, or a kind of agapic sensibility. So you can look to examples of this, an orientation to a will to pleasure, kind of hedonic philosophies. You go back to ancient Greece and look at its Syrianism and Epicureanism. There's a certain, certainly in early Freud, before he introduces the concept of the death drive, sort of reduces human motivation to eros. And even utilitarian and consequentialist ethics presume, that pleasure is the fundamental motivation of life. I think there's an element of truth in all of those. We could look at Adler and Nietzsche or Machiavelli as examples of philosophies of a will to power, and Plato, Hegel, Marx, and critical theory, many of which we've covered today, as a will to justice. And then we can look to some examples of agapic motivation in Martin Luther King, but also Buddha, Jesus, Augustine, Francis of Assisi, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so having understood that theory of motivation, what I want to suggest is that they're all important motivations. The motivation for pleasure, power, justice, and love are important motivations in the human condition. What makes them disordered is the priority within which they're ordered. So when we tend to prioritize a will to pleasure, when that becomes the preeminent goal, we tend to develop certain kinds of individual pathologies like addiction, or social pathologies like consumerism. When we prioritize a will to power, we get narcissism, antisocial personality, Machiavellianism, and social pathologies like domination, oppression, and totalitarianism. And when we prioritize a will to justice, we get frustrated because we rarely ever achieve conditions of justice. And so we get depressed, we get anxious, and we get enraged. And that can lead to revolutions and insurrections and violence and war. And at the social level. When we prioritize a will to love, or understood as in an agapic sense, then we transform pleasure, power, and justice into productive motivations that are oriented toward King's beloved community. So let me outline what that would look like. So when we prioritize a will to love within a hermeneutics of love, then pleasure is transformed into joy. Joy is a byproduct of virtues cultivated through the realization of capacities for agapic regard. We become intrinsically rewarded by meeting our intrinsic motivations for self-esteem, belonging, and relatedness. Power becomes transformed into competency. Rather than asserting our power through domination and oppression, We recognize legitimate authority, which is a recognition of competency, right? Which again is the meaning of an intrinsic need. And competency is a virtuous capacity to achieve social roles that contribute to valuable personal and social ends, namely the creation of a commons that meets the basic needs of the members of society, especially when we emphasize mutuality as an ethic that guides that that power. And then justice becomes transformed into dignity and solidarity. So there has to be a balance, right, between autonomy and solidarity based on recognition of the dignity of each person, and where the dignity of each person is actualized through self-transcendence and social duty. So we recognize my own dignity, I recognize the dignity of others, and with the recognition of my own dignity comes a certain obligation, right, to do something with that dignity, right, to become self-transcendent and give back to others to help foster the good society. Okay, so what I'm drawing from here is the concept of a hermeneutics of love. Ontologically, you could say it's founded in a recognition of the dignity of the person, rooted in shared existential conditions, and understanding the human being as a social animal, as a capable we intentionality, as Husserl calls it. It has epistemological foundations that I think you can get, that it's hermeneutic, of course, it's interpretive, and it's also drawing from phenomenology as a means of disclosing ontological conditions as they're given to experience. You can't, in other words, you can't really discover just dignity or we intentionality through, quantitative experimentation. You're never going to get there. You're only going to be able to get there through qualitative inquiry. And I think we could look to Rogers in his discussion of unconditional positive regard as just an example of that. Or I think a really good example of an epistemology rooted in a hermeneutics of love is in Maslow. Maslow talks about what he calls love knowledge, right? It's a way of knowing grounded in a kind of agapic regard. And he thinks that science is really impossible unless you love what you're studying, like good science. And then ethical foundation, that there's a kind of personalist ethic that we could move toward at least an aspiration toward universal human rights based on recognition of intrinsic human dignity and we intentionality, so that we have both rights and duties as members of the community. All right, so now we're ready. Oh, just in time. We're going to have a half an hour to have a discussion about it. So now I want to sort of I've laid out all my ducks. And so now I'm going to tell you why I think war is a form of social pathology. So here we go. Are y'all ready? Still with me? You haven't lost you yet? Okay. So let me just go down. Just follow me here. So one, war is a dynamic social process that causes extraordinary loss of resources, life, and mental and physical health of human lives. That shouldn't be very controversial. It's pretty obvious, right? War is, by its very nature, objectifies and exploits people by using them as a means to an end, rather than recognizing them as ends in themselves. And this is a failure of dignity recognition, like in Honith's theory of recognition. Maladaptive macrostructures such as the military-industrial complex sustain and perpetuate militarism and war for irrational ends that do not serve the interests of societies or the members of those societies. They serve usually a wealthy elite. And maybe even not them, maybe just an inhuman industrial system. War and militarism colonizes families and civil societies in the service of the nation state. So in that sense, pointing to the division of society issue. Propaganda perpetuates second order disconnects between the origins of war and the interests of an elite class and the false consciousness of citizens who come to support the war, believing themselves, patriots and patriotic for doing so. This cultivates consensual validation in support of the war, and that becomes a pathology of normalcy. Okay. Heroism within the military operates to co-opt a basic need for recognition and esteem in the interest of an irrational system. Recognition of the dignity of the enemy is undermined through a socially patterned defect, through co-optation of a desire for identity and self-esteem that's cultivated through hostility toward the out-group and identification with the in-group, which is a failed terror management coping style. It's a style of coping it's a style of coping with death anxiety, but a very destructive one. War fosters a narcissism, you might call it a group pride, which undermines relatedness. It frustrates the need for transcendence by elevating destructiveness over creativity as a means to peaceful resolution of conflicts. It fosters herd conformity rather than allowing for free expression of individual dissent. It elevates the irrational, hatred and violence, over the rational, peaceful resolution of conflict through diplomatic means. War necessitates and perpetuates hierarchical, dominant social structures as a means to control members of the society, especially the military, and to legitimate the irrational social order. War exploits pathological human tendencies toward memetic rivalry and scapegoating. War exploits death anxiety to foster maladaptive forms of self-esteem and identity formation that become dependent on othering and dehumanizing the enemy in the outgroup. War undermines basic human needs, including physiological needs, safety needs, and needs for relatedness of its citizens. And it results from prioritizing, I will argue, it results from prioritizing lower needs for power and justice over the higher level motivation of agapic love, paradoxically transforming competency into domination and justice into vengeance and hatred for the enemy, which undermines both justice and power. So it ends up being self-defeating. So I think you could probably come up with lots of challenges, but I just found this quote today by Bill Burr, which I think is pretty appropriate. He says, everybody should just quit the military around the world, and that's it. It's done. We're not doing this anymore. You lunatics, go sit down and solve your problems another way. There's no world where you should watch somebody of any nationality have to say goodbye to their kids because two rich people are having a temper tantrum with each other and have decided to have a war. So that pretty much, Bill Burr says it much better than I did. So, but I think he sums it up. I sometimes say that maybe the only thing standing between us and the apocalypse is the comedians. You know, humor can say what can't otherwise be said sometimes. I think there you can think of lots of challenges, I'm sure, to the war as social pathology argument. I'm coming at this with enormous amount of humility, knowing that people have been trying to solve the whole war problem for a long time. I'm not the first one to come along to try to deal with this little problem. I don't expect to be the one who's going to solve it, but I like to be at least somebody who's trying, you know. So I think about, you know, one of the most obvious objections is, look, war is endemic to the human condition, right? It's always been with us. It always will be with us. Isn't it naive and idealistic to suggest that we're capable of transcending this propensity to war? And so my answer is that we're living in an age of thermonuclear weapons. I mean, Putin has his finger on the button, and all he has to do is send one of those supersonic missiles or whatever the hell they're calling them these days, you know, into U.S. territory, and we have a thermonuclear global war that will literally end our race and every living organism on the planet, except for probably the cockroaches. And good for them. You know, so in an age of thermonuclear weapons, our failure to overcome this propensity for war is going to result sooner or later in our mutual destruction. So that's our alternative. Do we all want to die, have our children and our children's children die in a horrific nuclear winter? Or become a shadow on a wall somewhere from a nuclear blast? Well, if we're not willing to accept that fate, we have no choice but to hope that peace is possible. You know, and I would point to the fact that there's very good evidence that the reason why human beings still exist and the Neanderthals don't is that we killed them all off through a genocide. There's increasing anthropological and archaeological evidence for that. That means that human beings have an endemic tendency to commit genocide. And the 20th century is no better illustration of that, right? Think of how many genocides happened just in the 20th century. But nobody's going around saying, well, genocide is, just endemic to the human condition. It's naive to suggest, that we would end genocide. We find it intolerable. What would it look like if we lived in a world where war was as intolerable as genocide? It might not make it less likely, but it might make it somewhat less frequent. It's a good step forward. Okay, so the other potential objection I wanted to answer to is, why elevate a hermeneutics of love over a hermeneutics of suspicion, using Paul Ricoeur's term? Well, I would say one of the dangers, I think, of emphasizing a hermeneutics of suspicion is that it's an agonistic kind of style of interpretation. It tends to aggressively seek to dismantle narratives, to disclose presumably hidden agendas. And so it fosters cycles of distrust and often results in forms of interpretive violence. And that can actually perpetuate the very conditions that foster war rather than peace. And I would say that hermeneutics of suspicion, Paul Ricoeur names the three masters as Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx. So I would say the problem with Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx, by the way, they're all brilliant. I think they're all someone we all need to read them, and they all disclose important truths. But their major problem is they misprioritize lower motivations, and they place them above higher motivations, in my argument. Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx locate pleasure, power, and justice respectively above agapic love. And so they undermine the ordering power of agapic love to transform the lower motivations into virtues, and specifically in the case of war, into peacemaking capacity. So some recommendations for cultural therapeutics. So what do we do? I mean, there's lots of things we could do, but I'll just mention a few. Educating people in personalistic and eudaimonic ethics for cultivation of respecting human dignity and cultivating peacemaking capacities to foster agapic relations with others. Metabletic phenomenology as a depth analysis of cultural dynamics and insight into our neuroses as socioses. Immanent critique and diagnosis of cultural systems through hermeneutic of love. Andrew Felder and I have developed a cultural existential approach to therapy, where you can use individual therapy that includes both depth, looking at the individual history, but also a breadth dimension, looking at the social and cultural dimension of the person's suffering, how it's embedded within certain macro structures as part of their treatment. And then training people in nonviolent interventions and peacemaking capacities. I think there's just not enough of that going around. I think a lot of people don't even know how you would go about solving conflicts in nonviolent ways, because we're just not taught that. When I was in school, when I learned history, it was the history of war. That was it. And it was very clear in retrospect, when I started thinking about it, that clearly we were being socialized, to be warmongering citizens, ready to go to die for the nation. And we need a different way of teaching history. All right, so let me open it up for discussion. And just here's some questions that we might want to have a conversation about. Do you think this idea of social pathology is valid and viable? And if not, why? I'm interested in hearing your criticisms. Like you won't hurt my feelings if you think it's a dumb idea. I'd be interested in hearing your
Oh, no,
your
it's not a dumb idea. I think it's a great idea, but I want to add something to it.
Yes, okay.
Statistically, pardon, I don't look well today. I have only slept for a few hours.
Yeah, okay.
But the death rate, the category of the deaths by the ages, if you look at it, of male and female, the highest cause of the death is the unintended accident. And for male children, from the age of 5 to 15, the second highest cause of death is suicide. So the number one is the unintended accident, and the second is suicide. And the third one, I'm not sure which one it is, but the fact that the suicide is that high, and nobody is taking a look at it, why this is so. And humanity thinks of why men become so aggressive in this culture. I think there is some connection to it, but I'm kind of like frustrated nobody's taking a look at it. I think anybody who is frustrated, you should do it themselves, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure if I have aptitude to do so. And also that male tendency of aggression. And if you look at the case of Jeffrey Epstein and all the upper class people involved in, and a lot of it was covered up, a lot of Wall Street executives who were connected to it, as a matter of fact. And nobody actually talked about it. It was kind of like forgotten. The fact that it is so is that maybe it is something not intrinsically, but the way society is set up makes our reaction to that nothing else but to that direction. And also the fact that society itself forces people to, not right now, at least in Western society, but still in East and many other societies, make people to marry and have children. And to that pressure against one's will, just increases the child abuse. And how that leads to the suicide rate of teen and preteen. I mean, goodness, that's hideous, horrible. And then how does that relate to male aggressiveness? And also this kind of pedophilia among upper class. And I think this definitely is somehow related to war. And the people around it, people around who is interacting with and serving and also working with these people, I think it's all of us that somehow we are connected. But I missed the session previously in the mindfulness. And it's not just mindfulness of like inside meditation, but mindfulness and recognizing what is our pattern that perpetuated. And also if there is abuse, we should recognize it and try to address that problem actually, and bring them into justice. You say justice, we shouldn't have justice, but in this case, we have to.
Well, I'm not saying we shouldn't have justice. I'm just saying that justice has to be prioritized correctly.
I see. Okay, sorry about that.
So, for example, if I prioritize justice over love, then that tends to become an ethic of vengeance, right? An eye for an eye. Whereas an agapic love allows for mercy.
I'm not really sure, because in the old days there was no such thing for justice as for animals, but nowadays it is. And so I guess it is somehow what you're talking about is that it's not justice for just one standard, but I'm not saying we should put it as a practical justice, but what is the how can we make the most justice for everyone in a mutually agreeable way? I guess that's what it is.
Yeah, well, I think that from a hermeneutics of love perspective, it's really about cultivating certain styles of relating that are oriented towards willing the good of the other, you might say, right? And that's about self-transcendence rather than patterns of domination. And the problem is when you live within social structures that are hierarchically structured and perpetuate systems of domination and subordination and oppression, then it tends to foster the very conditions that mitigate against relations of mutuality and love. So you have to work on both creating socially patterned, positive social patterns of character, educating people in the virtues, you might say, of loving regard for others. Think of Roger's essential conditions, right? And at the same time, working to transform the social system so that people can actually live those virtues out because they're socially rewarded rather than punished by the social systems. So those would be that's my first
I have
thought.
something else to say, but I'm going to finish because it's going to take too long.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So what about the idea that war is a form of social pathology? What do you think about that? I see a lot of people who are making, I think I'm feeling the drumbeat of war happening right now. I hear a lot of people very much getting behind the idea of the United States entering into this conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I think in a certain sense, I can see how persuasive that could be. You know, from my position, you know, it's insane. I mean, Putin's, you know, invasion of Ukraine is insane, you know, and there's no easy solution, right, to that. But I think the fact that the whole situation is pathological and insane, I think is maybe something we can have some consensus around. But whether, you know, does that mean that we have a obligation to sort of get involved? I don't know. I think we need finding nonviolent ways of resolving the dispute seems to me to be preeminent. Otherwise, we lead to an escalation that will, you know, lead to our mutual destruction. So I don't see that as an option. And I think that my sense is that Biden is taking that position, at least for now, which is comforting. But I don't know for how long.
Yeah, you know, Brent, what I'll get in here just in terms of, it's part of what I was trying to talk about in my address Friday morning, except that I think that part of the problem that fuels all of this is hierarchicalizing and privileging certain values and ways of living over others that invite the subjugation of whatever that value is to fight back. And, you know, I think the dilemma happens, and if it's a hermeneutic of love that tries to understand the values that are operating even in the one who's the enemy, so to speak, the one who's hard to understand, as Dostoevsky would remind us, you know, how can we love the one who wants to dominate? You know, how can we love the one who wants to exclude? And my whole thing is that's why I'm asking for us to declare ourselves an independence from the medical model, because anytime we get into deficit correction, we're perpetuating the very thing that sets up the kind of antagonism and the sense of subjugation that calls for fighting back. And so I think it's easier for us to, and I'm all for hermeneutics of love and I'm against war, but that's my personal values. But I've also got to understand that love has to somehow or another be open to the one who wants war. There's something powerful about its attractiveness, almost like that kind of French jouissance, that desire. And I think there is no way to, if I were to sit down with Putin, we'd be in a nuclear war if I was in charge, which is what I said Friday. That's why I'm glad I'm not. You know, but if I were to sit down, I've got to find some way to hear from his soul what's operative for him, even if it's not for me. And I think we too quickly, not you, but I think there's a tendency to too quickly, particularly on the left, get just as fundamentalist in terms of imposing certain ways of how things should be in a dominating way, unwittingly.
Right.
You know, that kind of thing. I don't think Putin's mentally ill. I think he's following a certain value system that's very different from mine and very different from those who don't like bullying internationally. You know, but he's living out a value system in that sense. I think there's a tendency, if something's different, this is where that pathology of normality comes from. Right. You know, if something's different, then it must be pathological if it's different from me. You know, I'm making, you feel me?
Yeah. I think in some ways, this idea of what I find valuable about shifting from pathologizing individuals to looking at larger social systems in an interesting way is it ends up undermining the whole pathological project. Right?
Yeah, I guess for me though,
Yeah.
My concern is we're continuing to use pathology of social systems. And
Right.
so I'm wondering if we can identify troubling kinds of, maybe it's just a semantic non sequitur or something, or not non sequitur, but something that's irrelevant. I think the very idea something has to be pathologized, I think, is part of the difficulty.
Huh.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, I see where you're coming from there, and I think there's a debate, I think, in the literature around that too, on social pathology, that I guess I didn't touch on too much, but the idea of it usually comes out around debates. It tends to come out in the context of debates about is society an organism that can be understood, according to like a disease model, right? That's the debate. Now, where I try to wiggle my way out of that problem is that I say, well, it's a metaphor, right? And metaphors become dangerous when you take them literally, but only to that extent. If you understand it as a metaphor, then it can be useful. But if it becomes problematic, then you can dispense with it. If there's
I think that's what I do with teaching psychopathology, as long as we're talking about pathos as passion.
That's right.
As an expression of suffering and joy, rather than a rank ordering of who's the good human being and who's the bad human being.
Right.
The Taoists have a great proverb that says, evil begins when the good person enters the room.
That's great.
Can
so let me respond to that. That's a really excellent point, is that when I think of, this is why I find the whole debate on pathology in the critical theory literature, I think the problem is they're stuck on defining pathology according to the medical model, and that if you understand pathology simply as the logos of the pathos, right, then it's simply trying to understand the meaning of the suffering. That's and if we're doing that, then we're not disease mongering, whether doing that individually or collectively. So I agree. I think you're making me realize I need to emphasize that more in what I'm doing, and because that's certainly where I'm coming from, is not rejecting the disease model, as I have in all of my other research outside of thinking about social pathology, including at the collective level, but actually making this shift from the individual to the collective level, partly as a way of sort of showing that the disease model, in a certain sense, has no clothes. The emperor has no clothes, so to speak. And by shifting it to the collective model, I think it's easier to show that a disease model is problematic. So that's always been my interest. So I think to collapse to sort of now return to a literal kind of disease model of psychopathology, but at a collective level, looking at the collective as a kind of organism, this disease, I think is a bad, it's not the right move. Yeah. So I think that you articulated that very well.
we go back to the war solutions, or the
Yeah.
solution to the enemy?
Yeah.
Because in a hermeneutics of love, then my worldview is how we use that towards a violent enemy is to, diplomatically, of course, as we would hope our Secretary of State does, is talk with Putin in our specific world crisis, talk with Putin in a way that doesn't discount his very different values, but help him find a way of negotiating to get his values met, yet stop annihilating groups of people.
Yeah.
And not to escalate. I mean, isn't that a form of, and we can do that interpersonally or familiar, at the level of family, differences, and, you know, social and.
Yeah, I mean, one way I've been thinking about the issue, I don't know if this is addressing the issue in quite the way you're, if this is getting at your concern, but I think one of the things that I've been interested in is that when you listen to, you know, there's an element of the news media in the US and in Europe that, you know, it has a propagandist sort of element to it, right? That sort of,
Lame.
you can, you know, that they'll bring on people that are clearly members of the military industrial complex, and they have their own, you know, motivations for wanting us to get into war, to send weapons to Ukraine, because there's a lot of money to be made, you know, on war. So I think we have to be careful of that. But I think if you can kind of get beyond that and accept the fact, and this is not saying that what Putin is doing is not morally unjustifiable and wrong and heinous, the innocents that are being killed in Ukraine. But I think we have to, I don't think there's a lot of effort to try to understand how we came to this point. Looking at the history and the genealogy. And honestly, I think if you begin to look at the history a little bit, I think you can see that it's not as surprising to understand it, as wrong as it is. It's less surprising when you understand the historical context, that NATO was originally organized as to be antagonistic to the Soviet Union, and it continued to be to set up, you know, if you think about it, if you're essentially on a continent where the majority of the other nations that you're neighbors with are part of an organization that was designed to exclude you and to operate against you, and then you have a you know, let's say Cuba, you know, would be the equivalent of Ukraine. You know, it's Cuba a little bit smaller than Ukraine, but Ukraine would be, you know, like Cuba in terms of our proximity. And then suddenly that organization was saying, okay, we were formerly part of Soviet Union, but now we're going to join these antagonists, right? That becomes an existential threat to the Soviet Union. And a lot of people don't realize that we had there was a treaty with Russia about nuclear proliferation in Europe that was broken, I think, back in 2016. So we began to put nuclear weapons adjacent to Russia. And I think if you can trace this escalation towards war and wanting to reconstitute the former Soviet Union to that moment, I think. Mm-hmm. So we have a certain culpability. We could have gone in the opposite direction. We could have moved toward integrating Russia into, you know, dissolving NATO, creating a more unified Europe, you know, including Russia rather than excluding Russia, but we didn't. We could have moved towards reducing nuclear arms in Europe, but we moved towards proliferation of nuclear arms in Europe. And that now, you know, so I think we can't just wash our hands and say, oh, evil Putin, he's the reason that this is happening, without recognizing our own shit mm-hmm. and how we help contribute to this. And I think if we don't have that culpability, then we're not going to go into this with the proper humility to solve it peacefully.
Oh, I agree with what you're saying. I mean, both sides have to own up to what their involvement was to bring it to this place.
Right.
I think I was, you know, responding with, you know, you have this enemy, and kind of like part of hermeneutics of love has to do with loving one's enemy, and how do we do that? And that's right. By understanding.
So I think that we have to, I mean, from a hermeneutics of love perspective, we have to love Putin. That doesn't mean accepting what he's doing or morally, right. It means just the opposite. If you love someone and they're doing something that's beneath their dignity, you know what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. You don't force them to see the right way, you know, but you would want to desire to elevate the other person, you know, and ultimately that doesn't mean once you're in that attitude of wanting to sort of reform the other person and not destroy them, and to shift them from enemy to friend, you're in a different mindset. The question becomes, how do we get Putin from being an enemy to being somebody who could be a friend?
Mm-hmm.
I don't hear anybody having that conversation. It's just the opposite. It's he's just being depicted as a monster. And the only thing you can do with a monster is to kill it.
Which would be against hermeneutics of love.
Yeah.
Hermeneutics of
Well,
love.
I think it would be unethical in a certain sense, right? Because it just, as soon as you're in that mindset, then you're in the cycle of violence that's going to escalate into the war of all against all. And that's going to lead to our mutual destruction. But if you begin to look at your enemy, you can protect yourself, you can defend yourself and protect yourself at the same time, willing the good of your enemy and wanting to make them your friend. That's the trick. How can I defend myself and not condone wrongs that my enemy is doing, but at the same time, always seeking to ultimately to reconcile. I think Martin Luther King, was a real genius at articulating that. If you read his speeches, how to love your enemy, I don't think anybody articulated as well as he did. Even Jesus didn't articulate as well as King did.
Thank you.
But I think that's actually extremely difficult for everyone, isn't it? Not just like that. That's like a 0.001% can actually do it, because a lot of these people who are into the cycle is the mindset is already set and they don't want to see, or they're addicted to that kind of mindset. And there isn't enough educational system that train people to do that. So I think the psychology should be taught from the high school, but the current school system is to make a productive, competent, and obedient worker, not thinking citizens. So that has to be that is the, I mean.
Yeah, I think the question is, I think it requires operating within an agapic sensibility, within a hermeneutics of love, is not easy, because it requires almost a supernatural hope in that everyone is potentially redeemable. If you don't have that hope, then you really can't, then don't bother. I mean, I would say hermeneutics of love is not for you. You have to operate from a hope that people can be redeemed. If people can't be redeemed, then it's not going to work. So I think that's the ontology that you're starting with, the philosophical anthropology that you're starting with, is going to set up, it begins there. If you believe that people have a fundamental dignity and intrinsic worth and value, and that they're redeemable, then hermeneutics of love makes sense. But if you don't accept that, then hermeneutics of love could be, won't be.
No, I think people can be redeemable, because I have seen that. But the thing is that, but the truth of the reality is statistically and practically that is not true.
But I'd like to jump in and challenge that, because I think a lot of times the statistics.
It is true, but statistically it is low, only because we have systems that perpetuate this.
Yeah.
Well, including how we count what is invisible, the intangibles. I mean, I do think that it's much more prevalent than we see. And I do think that there is an opportunity for the kind of agapic love to be shown. I don't think psychology is going to do a damn thing to save us from that. And I think that the love that we're going to be able to offer has to start with the recognition of the pain and the brokenness that people feel that resist being loving and should.
But are you saying that people who practice agapic love need to sacrifice themselves?
I think they do, yes, but I don't think that means not being resolute.
Agree with that.
It depends on what we mean by sacrifice.
Yeah.
But
I mean, I don't think that with Putin,
are you talking about the life? I don't want
at times, yes, but I think agapic love means recognizing the dignity in the other person.
I don't know if I want the other person to sacrifice their life to do so. I think it is I think they have the right to defend their life.
They do. And the problem is, I don't think we'll have to get into having to do that if we were practicing a hermeneutic of love.
Not always.
Well, I would say that if we're operating with a hermeneutic of love, And I don't think that means we can't defend ourselves, but I think
Right.
you defend yourself from an attitude of doing the least possible harm to the other in that interaction, right? Like there's a tendency, even if we think our reactions are proportional to the other person's aggression, in reality, usually it's disproportional. At least the other person will perceive it as disproportional, even if it isn't, right? So there's always this danger when we retaliate violence for violence that we're in that cycle, right? Because it's not just about what's objectively happening, it's about perceptions. You always perceive the attacks on you as worse than the other person perceives them, right? So how do you calculate that? Like what's proportional and what's not? So I think that from a nonviolent perspective, you have to defend yourself, but defending yourself in the least violent way possible, right? And in a way that I think the most effective ones are the ones that appeal to the conscience of the aggressor. In other words, ones that, like, I'll give you an example. Like if you look at the protests, I think it was in Birmingham, when the police were, putting the fire hoses on the protesters. And there's some video of the protesters who are going up. Now, these are Christian protesters, and then the police are also Christian. These are some Southern, Christian boys, in police uniform, right? And so the protesters would go over and ask the police officers if they would pray with them. And if you look at the video of that, how the police react, they're very confused by that action, because they're acting aggressively towards these protesters, black and white people, and they're approaching them saying, "Listen, we understand you're doing your job, but would you just pray with us?" And that sets that you can see it in the in the nonverbals of the police officers, that it puts them in a state of cognitive dissonance.
I suppose it's an individual choice to sacrifice oneself or not. I don't think one can impose that to any other. But to decide that is to have a critical thinking capacity, and our education system doesn't promote people to have that much.
So I would say, yeah, what I'm suggesting is that if you can do interventions that appeal to the conscience of the enemy, put them in a state of cognitive dissonance, then you're moving away from the cycle of violence toward potential reconciliation. It may be a long way down the road, but you're moving things more in that direction. Where when you retaliate, even in defense, the other person won't necessarily see it as a justifiable self-defense. They'll see it as a further provocation and justification for their aggression.
I wanted to know the time wise, so Brent, if you want to hang around and keep talking, that'd be great. But just I know others want to make sure they can feel they can tap out.
I think we're
Brent some room.
Probably, yeah. I'm certainly willing to stick around if people want to still.
Yeah.
But
and also for those who bow out, please return in an hour or so to hear Dr. Kleinplatz's fellows address, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Before I go, because I am going to go,